Today I'm speaking with Diana Winston. Diana is a very experienced mindfulness teacher and the co-author with Susan Smalley of Fully Present, The Science, Art, and Practice of Mindfulness. She also has a new book titled The Little Book of Being, Practices and Guidance for Uncovering Your Natural Awareness. And it's a very useful book. Diana teaches mindfulness in many different contexts, and she's the director of mindfulness education at the UCLA Semel Institute's Mindful Awareness Research Center. Diana's work has been discussed in the New York Times, O Magazine, Newsweek, the Los Angeles Times, and in many other journals. She's done a lot of work teaching mindfulness to teenagers as well, and also working with people with ADHD for research at UCLA. And she's a member of the Teachers Council at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, where she was trained by Jack Kornfield. She's been practicing mindfulness since 1989, and this includes a year spent as a Buddhist nun in Burma, studying with Sayadaw U Pandita. And in this conversation, we talk about many things related to the logic and practice of mindfulness, and talk about 3 different ways to experience the practice. And now, without further delay, I bring you Diana Winston. I am here with Diana Winston. Diana, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
So you've written a really beautiful and useful little book. It is titled The Little Book of Being, and we have pretty similar practice backgrounds, so it'll be interesting to track through your adventures as a yogi and as a teacher. Well, first, how do you describe what you do now? Because are you still associated with UCLA? And yeah, so give us your potted bio now with respect to how you teach and where you are.
Sure. So I'm currently, and have been for the last 13 years, at the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center, where I run the education department. I'm the director of mindfulness education. So I'm teaching mindfulness and through, all sorts of domains, both in the school and then externally to many, many different, the general public and to anyone who's kind of interested, like in schools and businesses and in healthcare settings. And then I'm also training teachers. That's a big thing that I do. I've been training mindfulness teachers for the last 9 years now. So I'm mostly there. I'm still at Spirit Rock. I'm on the Teachers Council at Spirit Rock as well.
Right, right. Are there working scientists associated with Mark now? I mean, are there people doing neuroimaging experiments or anything around mindfulness at UCLA?
Yeah, so we're part of the Cousin Center for Psychoneuroimmunology. And then in that center, they're the ones writing the grants for the mindfulness studies. So
Right.
we'll often offer our protocol, which is called MAPS, Mindful Awareness Practices. And we're currently doing one for Alzheimer caregivers, breast cancer survivors, and we're about to start one for some people who've gone through stem cell transplant. So we're doing a number of different ones.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Nice. Well, it's interesting. I find that I'm not especially focused on the research. I mean, I'm reading the research. I'm slated to talk with more people who are actually doing the research, but I don't find that my recommendations for meditation are putting much weight on the research thus far. In fact, I'm now fond of saying that I would be recommending meditation practice even if we found out that it was a little bad for you, right? Like there's clearly so much to be learned from it, and we know it is enhancing our well-being in some more global sense that we can authenticate that directly, and whether or not it improves the immune system or staves off cortical thinning or does any of the other things that it seems to have done, at least according to some studies. It would be great if all of that were true, but if all of those results wash out, I'm not really going to care. I don't know if you feel the same way.
We do. I
Yeah.
do feel the same way. Absolutely. And the science, I think it's inspiring and it brings people in the door quite a bit, at least through UCLA. People come because they're interested and they've heard that it helps with depression and anxiety and chronic pain and those kinds of things. But in the end, right now, the research is still really young. And I
Yeah.
think people they overestimate it. It gets hyped quite a bit, like, oh, it's going to solve all your problems. And of course, it's not. And the research still has a long way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also somewhat ironic that most of the meditation apps now are very focused on sleep. And as far as I know, the research currently is that, if anything, the connection between meditation and sleep is that it undermines sleep rather than improves it. So
I'm not
it's
sure that's exactly, I mean, we did a study where it helped older adults who had insomnia, and just 6
mm,
weeks of mindfulness help, but that was one study. Again, it's,
right.
things need to be replicated. I think on long-term retreats and intensive
Well,
retreat
yeah, we know what happens
practice,
there. Yeah,
yeah,
you wind up sleeping
sleep is
less.
undermined.
And you just have to talk to Joseph Goldstein about his sleep to know that
That's true.
the direct connection between
Yeah.
mindfulness and sleep is it's haphazard at best. Okay, so well, let's start at the beginning. How did you get into meditation?
I grew up in a family that had some interest in sort of Eastern stuff, I guess you
Mm,
could say. My mother was in the 70s doing a lot of exploration. She was doing things like EST, and she was involved with a Gurdjieffian school and
oh, interesting.
various things. So it was kind of in my family. And so when I decided to go to India in the 80s, my parents were just like, "This is great. Diana's going to India." So I think it was a very different response than most kids probably
Yeah.
would have gotten. So I ended up, well, I was an exchange student in Thailand first in the late 80s, and then I went to India after college. I was at Brown and I graduated, and then I was sort of, what am I going to do? So I went back to
Mm.
Asia.
What were you studying in college?
Well, something totally unrelated, theater and
Hmm.
political science, and
Right.
unrelated.
Yeah.
So I went back, I went to India, and I ended up in Dharamsala just because some friends had said, "You have to go to Dharamsala, India, where the Dalai Lama has the government in exile." So I went and got somewhat involved with some activist organizations there, and was not interested in meditation. I probably rebelling a little bit against my family.
Mm.
And then, but everything there was about meditation, so you were just kind of swimming in it. And I ended up deciding to take a course, and I did like a 10-day Tibetan Buddhist style kind of study course. And I had like a very profound moment of going like, this makes so much sense to my life. I couldn't even believe it. And I think it was when they were talking about just the way life is filled with changes, the ups and downs, called the worldly winds,
Hmm.
right? The praise and blame and gain and loss and pleasure and pain, all of that. And that there was no escape from that life was constantly that way. And I could kind of map my life up against that and feel like I was this person constantly looking for praise and running away from blame. And then they said, but there's a way out, and that is to learn practices that teach you equanimity and peace. And it just hooked me. And from there, so I studied for a little while in that tradition. And then I went down to Thailand and did my first Vipassana retreat. And it was incredibly hard, I remember. And that was when Ajahn Buddhadasa was still alive,
Hmm.
the famous Thai monk.
Mm.
And so I feel really lucky I got to exposure to his teachings
Yeah.
back then. So then when I was there at the end of that retreat, I was talking with the nun there, and she said to me, did you like this experience? I said, yes, I did. And she said, well, if you really want to meditate more, you should go to this place called Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts. And so I was from the East Coast, and it was only a couple hours from my home. And at first I said, no way, I would never do that. But I ended up doing my first 3-month retreat
Hmm.
soon after, like the following year.
Oh, nice. What year was that? Do you
That
remember?
was 1990.
Was I there? No, I did one in '89. I was on the 3 month in '89. Yeah, so we
Yeah, so we missed
missed by a
each
year. Yeah,
other. Uh-huh.
yeah. I think I was '89 and '97. I think for the 3 month. Yeah,
Yeah. No, it's funny because I think we have a lot of similar teachers and stuff, but we never met back
yeah,
then.
yeah. So then you got into Vipassana that way, and then from your book, you wind up in Burma studying with U Pandita, who I also sat with, not as long as you did, but for a few 2 month and 1 month retreats. It sounds like you had some of the same experiences I did in getting just kind of caught by the goal-oriented logic of the practice and seeking in a dualistic and ultimately painful way to get somewhere, and that retrospectively, it seems to you that you spent far too much time in that condition. How do you think about that experience?
Well, I think about it in a lot of different ways. I mean, I entered well, when I started practicing at Insight Meditation Society with Joseph and Sharon and all of them, they were big students of U Pandita during that time. And that was the methodology that was kind of being taught. And it really made sense to me. I mean, I loved it. I practiced in that way. My mind kind of responded to it. And I spent doing like a lot of different 3-month retreats with it in the 90s. And I feel like I couldn't see outside of that methodology, it just was the way kind of. And it wasn't until I decided to go practice with U Pandita in Burma, because he kept saying I would practice with him when he came to the States. And after a time, he kept saying, come to my monastery and become a nun, study with me.
Did you practice with him at IMS on that 2-month retreat?
There was a 1-month retreat I did. I forget. I don't know what year, but I don't.
Oh, it's possible we were on retreat together.
Yes,
with him.
maybe.
Yeah. Did you sit with him in Australia by any chance?
Nope. Oregon, a couple times.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we were
we missed each other.
In the same orbit. Yeah.
So I was just very hooked into it. Like I loved it, and I loved what was happening in my mind in the practice and the depth, and I did get very bought into the ideology, right?
Yeah.
Into the this is what enlightenment is. This is what you have to do to get it. You have to work hard. If you work hard enough, one day, boom, you will get enlightened. And so that was, I think it was this kind of mixed motivation for me. I mean, in retrospect, of course, I loved the practice. I loved just the depth of understanding that was coming in my mind. And then I was also like, I want to reach the goal. I got to get the goal. And if I do, then I'm going to be really special and really happy, and life's going to be good. And, I had these very kind of a lot of idealization of it.
Yes. The grandiosity of equanimity. Like you get to this place in a retreat where you think, okay, well, this is the way my mind is. If I can just stay here for the rest of my life, this is perfect.
Exactly.
It's close, if not perfect, close enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So when I went to Burma, I went kind of with this powerful motivation, okay, I want to get enlightened. I had this notion of what enlightenment was, which has expanded significantly since then. But at that time, it was this moment that they're trying to have you reach. And when greed, hatred, and delusion gets uprooted, and I just wanted that. And I thought if I ordained, I ordained as a nun. I shaved my head and did the whole, gave away my possessions, which isn't true. I just put them in storage. But I thought doing it as a nun would, give me more of a push to getting enlightened. And then I just kept working and working and working and being in that monastery with this so much effort put into it. And part of it was amazing. I don't think there was anything, well, let's say this. There were so many things that were powerful in practicing in that way, but it was very limited. And I think it played into my own sort of neurotic thinking and way of being, right? So I was very goal-oriented. I was very striving. I don't know if I hadn't become a mindfulness teacher, I would have seen this in other profession that I had been in.
Right.
But I hit a wall is what happened when I got to Burma. I hit a wall because I was practicing too hard, essentially. And I can share what, I assume you want me to share what happened. So I'm practicing and practicing, and it seems like every moment was a moment of not getting enlightened. It was like, okay, it's going to happen today. It's going to happen. No, it's going to happen tomorrow. And I would be setting myself up. And, my concentration at this point, it was now 6 months, 7 months, 8 months of deep practice. And I kept waiting for this thing to happen. And my mind was going through all sorts of, incredible things, but it wasn't what I thought it was. And so then there was just this point where I just pushed too hard, and I started to have a kind of emotional psychospiritual breakdown. You can't run a marathon as a sprint, essentially, right? I was just, if I just sleep less tonight, maybe that'll work. If I just sit for 4 hours, how about 5 hours without moving? If I just sleep with sitting up. I just kept coming up with new ways to push myself, thinking that if I tried harder, I would get something. And, and they're encouraging this. This is the challenge. And this is, I think, why.
It is the logic of the practice.
Yeah.
So the metaphor that I remember U Pandita often using was that the continuity of mindfulness is like rubbing two sticks together to get fire. And the moment you stop, they cool off, right? So basically the moment you encounter a discontinuity in your mindfulness, i.e. you become distracted, you have basically lost your momentum and you've got to start rubbing those sticks together again. So there really is this imperative to just turn down the screws on your mindfulness such that you're linking one moment to the next without fail and persisting long enough in that state. It is a kind of vigil. All there is for you to notice on that account is in each moment the evidence of your unenlightenment, essentially. Like you can become more and more equanimous with it. You can notice the three characteristics, obviously, but there's still part of you, if you're totally bought into that logic, at least in my experience, you're not disposed to recognize the sufficiency, in fact, the completely undefined nature of the present moment. Again, there may be some way to kind of thread this needle, but the thing that I was overlooking practicing under U Pandita was the thing that, in a Dzogchen context, I was told to be mindful of. On some level, it is just a conceptual shift. I mean, it's like there's a conceptual frame that you're no longer imposing on experience. It's allowing you to recognize something that's already there. But that's my experience, and I fight with Joseph about it whenever we hang out.
I think that it's a powerful logic. I think that like Theravadan Buddhism, or this particular form of Theravadan Buddhism, was preaching, and some people say that the Western mind in some ways is unsuited. I don't mean to make like stereotypes here, but apparently what I've heard is that in Burma, when they say, okay, practice harder, it's coming, people sort of just say, yeah, and relax. But when people who are driven people hear that, they go for it. And in a way, it's not so suited. But there's I have friends who, practice in this way and have deep, profound, many of us have deep and profound experiences and love it and continue to abide by it. So I know what you're saying, and I sort of had a similar story with it where I felt like I was always waiting for something to happen that was it seemed out of my reach all the time, and therefore I couldn't connect with the present moment in a kind of way. And there was also a depth of insight and beauty that was happening for me. So
there's a distinction you make in your book between focused and flexible and natural awareness. And that, I think that does sort of cover the territory we're talking about here. So maybe you want to introduce that.
Sure. So I was really interested. I'll share, I guess, the rest of my story in a little bit, but
Sure.
but I was interested in how these practices fit together, because there's the goal-oriented practice, and then it's very focused, very effort-based, and centered on objects. And then on the other end, there's like this wide open, spacious practice that is objectless. And I started looking at the way my meditation had manifested, and then the students I've been working with for a long time, and seeing like, oh, there seems to be actually a continuum, like what I'm calling a spectrum of awareness practices, where there's ways that our attention can be very narrow, very focused. There's ways it can be flexible and sort of ordinary awareness and awareness of the changing nature of things, and be more investigative, which I'm sort of calling it investigative now. Choiceless awareness can be choiceless, where you're just moving from object to object, more like the object's choosing you rather than you choosing them. And then natural awareness, where we have this open spacious. So the simple way I like to talk about it is just like, think about a camera. Camera can have a telephoto lens. It can take ordinary pictures, or it can have a panoramic lens. And I think that we go in meditation, in mindfulness practice, we go through different iterations. Like we'll go through one and then another, and it's helpful for me to distinguish it in that way, because I was trying to understand how these practices fit together, because they're all about awareness. They're all awareness practices, and it can't, in my mind, this is just my thinking, it can't be that just like, well, there's only one practice and this is the way, and everything else is inferior or something. It seems like there's just multiple ways of being aware. Part of the reason also, when I thought about the spectrum of awareness practices, is I've been I've been teaching for the first probably 10, 12 years or so, or even longer, 10 of teaching mindfulness. I was teaching more aligned with Upandita in a way.
Hmm.
Teaching, pay attention to your breathing, and when your attention wanders, bring it back and investigate what's happening, and then very object based. And then I started about 2 or 3 years ago teaching more of the open, spacious Dzogchen influence practices, and I didn't want my students to say, like, wait, is this now the superior practice of everything you've been teaching me for 10 years is wrong?
Mm.
Of course not. In my mind, they're all related, and they depend on each other in different ways, and they impact each other. So that's kind of where the spectrum of awareness practices came for me.
I might have a slightly different view of it in that it's definitely possible to learn the object-focused practice and to practice it and learn what you call the flexible, kind of choiceless practice, which is still object-focused, but as you say, the objects are kind of choosing you. You can play both of those mindfulness games and all the while feel that you are the subject, either aiming attention strategically in the first case or just kind of waiting to notice what you notice among the myriad objects in the second case, but always feeling like there's a locus of attention inside your head that is yourself, and you're waiting for that to go away. I mean, that is like the seat of your problem, really. I mean, you wouldn't be meditating if you didn't imagine there was something to be improved about that status quo. And then, in my experience, it was common to be playing, one of those two games of focus or choiceless awareness, and to have brief moments where the feeling of self would drop away. There'd be just seeing or just hearing, but they were totally haphazard. There was not a capacity of mine to produce that experience on demand. It was just that had to happen to me by virtue of some causes and conditions I couldn't really get in hand apart from putting myself on retreat, getting as much concentration and continuity of mindfulness as I could get. And because those moments seemed, those seem to be more in line with the actual teachings, right? Those seem to have taste more of the actual goal of being, free of the illusion of self. And because they seem contingent upon this kind of extraordinary effort of, a retreat setting and, meditating 12 to 18 hours a day, it seemed that insight was not available in ordinary moments of awareness off retreat. You've had no continuity. You've been distracted for an hour. You've just been watching television. You go to reach for your glass of water. And in that moment, you shouldn't expect to recognize the illusoriness of the self in precisely as profound a way as you could in the deepest part of a 3-month retreat. You're not near the top of the mountain now. You're at the bottom of the mountain, and you're going to have to schlep to the top to actually have more of that experience. And that's just not true, right? I mean, that's just not the way consciousness is. So when I got introduced to Dzogchen, and again, there was kind of a path through studying Advaita with Punjaji before then, it fundamentally undercut the logic of that practice for me. Now, it is also true to say that once you can practice from this place of just recognizing the centerlessness of awareness, yeah, well, then you can just focus on your breath if you want to, right? Like that can also become a condition of kind of non-dual awareness. It's not an obstacle to recognizing this thing. So they are totally compatible, but they're really only compatible from the side of having discovered what you're calling natural awareness, right? And if you haven't discovered that, apparently you're left with this dualistic effort that can be in one of these two modes of focused or flexible. And then you're waiting for something good to happen.
Yeah, except there's this whole territory. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and it makes sense to me. But I also see, and I don't know how you conceive of this, so I'm curious what you would say. There's a lot of freedom that happens for people in just the basic skill of learning to be mindful,
Yeah, no doubt.
right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people cannot have a calm or clear enough mind to even begin to open to these more non-dual states. And so to me, being able to practice with learning to just be in the present moment to, okay, you're watching TV and then you just mindfully grab your cup. There's a moment of a kind of freedom that's happening for
Mm.
people. And I think that it's not, I don't know, I just don't want to underestimate like the beauty of the simplicity of just being in the moment. And I also don't assume that it's that easy for people to have more non-dual states without sort of a basis in some
Hmm.
basic meditation.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of those points. It's just that I feel like, I mean, paradoxically, I want to tell people not to be satisfied with their practice until they're actually satisfied with their practice. It's like it's you're, and I don't mean you're satisfied with your state of being all the time. I'm just saying like until mindfulness really seems like an antidote to the illusion of having a problem, right? Until it can really cut through your anger or confusion, I don't want anyone to come away feeling like, well, okay, mindfulness doesn't actually work. And I think you can if you're only left with this strategic effort of, okay, I'm just going to put my attention on the breath for a second here because I was just getting really pissed off. And yes, I mean, granted, there is a respite even in doing that. I mean, that's a massive gain. I mean, there's 7.5, 8 billion of us. Most people are going to live their entire lives and not know that anything like that is an option, right? Hence all the mayhem we see around us in the world. But that gain, that is ultimately unsatisfying for a reason, because there's yet a further gain to make, which is to recognize that in a moment of real mindfulness, there isn't actually evidence of your unenlightenment. You're not actually bound by anything in that moment. And again, you might only enjoy the clarity of that just for a moment, and then you'll be identified with thought again. But to know enough about the map to know that that's available, rather than you're always doomed to be making this remedial effort to get somewhere, maybe at some point in the future, if you decide to go on retreat for years.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what's happening, I don't want to like conflate retreat practice and like daily life practice. And because I do feel like that methodology in retreat practice, the sort of goal oriented, gradual, can run into exactly all the things we're talking about.
Mm,
And then in daily life practice, for people who are not, I mean, I work with a lot of people who are never going to do 3-month retreats.
yeah.
I encourage it. Go do it. Go on retreats. We're always, inviting people to go on retreat. But for everyday people, there is freedom in just coming into the moment, in working with their emotions and not getting on the train that leads
Mhm.
them to somewhere they don't want to be, with their thoughts. There's the freedom. And then there's even like really simple ways that I think people access. I don't know if it's non-dual state. It's in the territory. I don't know if it's natural awareness, but
Mm.
I'll often just talk to people who are like very beginning, just they've never heard of mindfulness, and I'll ask in a lecture. I'll say, who's ever been out in nature and felt connected, at home, at peace, at ease? And 3/4 of the room raises their hand, and I feel like this just. I guess I'm sort of the school like it's all good.
Mhm.
Like whatever it does to help you access more peace, more ease, more emotional regulation, more all of that is good. And yes, there's this wonderful territory, and I think people need to know about it too. And I think one of the one of the ways, so I've been in the secular world teaching, and for as far as I've seen, most everybody teaches like pay attention to your breathing, your attention wanders, bring it back. It's kept within that realm of teaching. And
Mm.
so that was part of the impetus for my book, was to bring in these natural awareness, these objectless awareness of awareness states into the secular conversation,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah,
So,
well, the flip side of what I'm saying is that the real goal state of non-duality is available now off retreat with very little concentration. Granted, most people will have to have a certain degree of mindfulness to be able to kind of follow the instructions and notice what there is to notice there. But I think it's available to people much earlier. And the stuff that is really transfiguring of your experience on retreat most of it is irrelevant. The psychedelic component of all of that is irrelevant. The fact that you're experiencing unusual energy in your body and like all that stuff is no more empty of self than this ordinary moment of course awareness is if you can just recognize it. I want to urge people to realize that there's nothing magical about retreat per se, except for the fact that, as a matter of course, most of us tend to live in a way where we're overlooking this thing every moment of our lives. So, the retreat is the circumstance where you most deliberately attempt not to do that. So everyone who's practicing mindfulness, virtually everyone, starts out with this first form of just deliberately paying attention to the breath or to sounds or to.
Unless they start with your app.
Yeah, well, no, even on my app, I start people there. But so what do you say to someone who has a sense of what that mindfulness is like, and they can pay attention to the breath, and they notice they get lost in thought, and then they come back to the object of meditation? What do you say to introduce them to a more natural, non-dual style of awareness?
Well, I do different things. So I have a meditation that I teach where I'll take people through these different stops on the spectrum, where I'll start them with a focused awareness. I'll explain, kind of like I explained before, the way our attention can be narrow, our attention can be broad, and it can be everything in between. I show them that I explain what objects are, and then we want to talk about the difference between focusing on an object and focusing on that which is aware of the objects. So I can give some conceptual framework to it. And then if one meditation I do, and then there are others, but I'll start them with a focus practice where they're familiar. Then I open up to more flexible awareness. And I do more of a second category of investigating experience. When your attention gets pulled away, now stay with it, investigate it.
Hmm.
And then the third state I take them through is choiceless awareness, like we were talking about, where they let go of the anchor. So that's important. There's many people are dependent on their meditation anchor, on their breathing, for instance.
Mhm.
But in choiceless awareness, we let go of it. We just follow whatever is happening in our experience. And then the fourth, I'll bring them to natural awareness. And at that point, the invitation is sort of to let go of everything and just be and rest and open. And it kind of is this movement that I've seen has been very effective with people to recognize natural awareness in a way that makes sense with how they have been practicing.
Mhm.
And they also see that there are different ways to practice, because I want people to, I'll say in my own practice, I go through all of these different stops all the time,
Right.
and so I want people to be able to do that. And then the other thing, I can pause for a moment, but I also teach our practices I call glimpse practices. I did not make up that name, but a lot
Mhm.
of people call them glimpse
Did
practices.
did Locke Kelly make that name up, or is it?
He might have made it up, but then I feel like some Dzogchen teachers talk about it as well, or
I guess well, they do certainly talk about. I don't know what
glimpse.
Tibetan term is getting translated as glimpse, but I feel like glimpse is just an obvious reference to the shortness of the duration of
Yeah.
first recognizing this thing. So, do you want to take me through some of this for 5 minutes or so? We can go from focus to choiceless to natural, and how you would guide
Okay,
that.
I don't know if I can do it in 5 minutes, but I could
Yeah,
try.
sure. Do it.
We can see what happens.
There is in fact no rush, but
Okay. So as we settle here, just taking a breath or two to connect in and just feeling your body present and connecting in with whatever your meditation anchor is. For most people, it's the breathing, your abdomen rising and falling, chest expanding and contracting, or the air moving through your nose, sensations. Some people use sound as their anchor, so that which holds your attention, that which we always return to. So just staying with whatever is your anchor. Feeling our breath, breath after breath. And then when your attention wanders, which it will, just bring it right back to this spot you've chosen, to your abdomen or chest or nose. And we'll do that again and again, just for a minute or two, like being with your breath. And when it wanders, when your attention wanders, bringing it back. And this should be what people are familiar with, helping to stabilize, bring some clarity, concentration to your mind. And now as you continue, you can still stay connected to your anchor, to your breath. But now when something pulls you away, notice what it is that pulls you away. You can attend to it, feel it, sense it, notice it. Maybe it's a sensation in your body. Maybe the sound pulls you away. Maybe it's an emotion. You can feel it in your body shifting and moving through you. And then when it's no longer holding your attention, go back to your main focus. And this is what I call investigative awareness. It's more flexible. You don't have to just stay merely with your anchor. We could spend more time here exploring any of these areas, but we'll just move on to this third area, the choiceless awareness. Also, our mind is flexible. So this time, just the encouragement is to let go of your anchor, your main focus, and just let whatever is happening happen in your body and mind. There's thoughts and emotions and sounds. There's breath, there's sensations. And they tend to be happening in no particular order. So see if you can just notice moment after moment. Can you notice these sensations coming and going, these thoughts, emotions, the breath? If it starts to feel too much, then just go back to where it feels familiar. The breathing or your anchor. But otherwise, if you're comfortable, we're expanding our awareness to the whole field of whatever is happening. Just get curious about your experience. Feel, sense, notice. There's a sound, then a body sensation, then a memory, then an emotion, and we can just stay with it. We'll give that a try. And now we're going to expand into natural awareness. So the invitation here is to simply rest and let go. See if you can just be. Awareness is already present. So your attention, it's right there. Your mind is already aware. See if you can tap into that awareness. And you might notice that our minds are vast, spacious, like the sky. So instead of focusing on the clouds in the sky, all the thoughts and emotions and memories and plans and everything you'd been noticing before, can we shift to connecting with the sky? Just soften, wide open, spacious. Everything is just happening on its own. Can have a sense of your body expanded. Can listen out in the distance, the furthest sound you can hear. Just be here in this space. Soften. Just be. And now noticing your body present here. And whenever you're ready, you can kind of just feel yourself, the chair or wherever you are. And we can end the meditation, open our eyes if they're closed. Here we are.
There's something you wrote in your book which is very similar to something that Locke Kelly said when I was in conversation with him, which I find very useful, which is yet another conceptual tweak to this open awareness practice, which is to let awareness encompass the back of your body or what's behind you as a way of taking it out of the domain of just being pure centerless vision and having it fully incorporate the energetics of your feeling of being in the world. Because there can be a kind of Dzogchen view of just pure cognition. It's just like the knowing is centerless. But it is different if it subsumes the energy of your body. And so it's giving the instruction of like sort of noticing your back, the energy of the back of your body. I found that very useful, and you write about that in the book.
Yeah. It's helpful for me. I mean, that was all of the practices that I developed. I mean, some of them I learned from different teachers. I've studied even some with Locke as well.
Mm.
But for me, it's often these glimpses that I'll drop into my meditation practice. That's part of the point in how I teach it. That helps me feel both simultaneously embodied and spacious at the same time. It's very interesting, and it's noticing the back of my body that was like a big breakthrough for me. So that's one of the things I teach.
Actually, there was one instruction I wound up giving on the app recently that I had never heard or thought about before, but let me see if this works for you. So if you're sitting with your eyes closed and you become mindful of the sensations of your face, and then you switch to being mindful of the back of your head, and then you switch back to your face, and then switch back to the back of your head. And the pointing here is to recognize that you, as the witness of all this, are not behind your face or in front of the back of your head. Those two patterns of sensation are arising in the same place. You're just the condition in which that's appearing. I don't know if that is useful for you, but it seemed to be a way of undercutting the sense that, because the starting point for the dualistic form of attention is to feel generally that you're behind your face and aiming attention at, let's say, the breath. So the breath is in some way below you. It's below your locus of cognition. And when you become aware of the back of your head or your back, in some sense that seems to be behind you. And yet everything you can notice is appearing in the same place.
I think it's cool. I think it's fun. I mean, I enjoyed it just playing with it right now. Yeah.
So who are the teachers that have pushed you more in the direction of natural awareness? And maybe we can talk about the connection between practice and ethics and some other things here.
So I was, where we last left off, I was pushing in the U Pandita's monastery outside of Rangoon. I was in his forest monastery. I don't know if they had that when you were you?
No, I never went to
Oh,
Burma. No, I just the U.S. and Australia with him. Yeah.
well, they built this pretty snazzy monastery, but when I was there, it was not at all. It was a mess. It was under construction, and so they were still cooking out of this little hut with over like an open fire, and then they built this fancy new kitchen like a couple of years later, and it's more sanitary these days, as you can imagine. And then of course they were like building the monastery while I was there, so they were like hammers and jackhammers all day long, all day long. So that was a charming piece of it.
There should be a discount if you're
exactly
your monastic vows if they're going to be under renovation.
That's right. So I was practicing in that way, and I pushed myself, and I said I kind of hit this point like where it just all fell apart, and I pushed myself so much trying to be mindful every single second and not stop from rubbing those two sticks together at any moment that I just like I said, I fell apart. And then something weird happened in my mind where I couldn't be mindful. It was like that capacity just fell away, and I would try to be mindful, and and it wouldn't happen. It was very weird. And all this grief and emotions and feeling of unworthiness and feeling like I was a failure at the one thing that was the most important thing to me in the world. And it was pretty horrible. And then I was thinking I should leave, and I was planning to go to the beaches of Thailand or something just to get away. Right?
Yeah.
And I went to see Pandita, and I said, I decided to leave. And then he, in his classic way, he looked at me, he said, "Fine, leave." And then he said, "But if you do, the afflictions of the mind will overwhelm you. Like wherever you go, you're going to be stuck with yourself." And
you're going to be taking your mind with you.
Exactly. And I don't know, it was like something happened to me in that moment, and I decided that night I kind of went back and to my little hut, and just something in me decided that I wanted to try to stay, but I needed to practice in a really different way. And so while I was there,
and this was after like 9 months of practice?
Yeah, maybe 7, 8, something like that. It was the summer, and it was very isolating. There were like no other Westerners there at that point. It was like I was alone. I was on my own. And he wasn't even coming that much. Like he was traveling around the world teaching and doing his thing. So I had other teachers, but they were less skilled. So there was a library, and I say that in quotes. It was basically a bookshelf, and it had all these books that were all written by his teachers, by Mahasi Sayadaw, by all the Burmese monks. And there was like sitting in the library was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
There's some Tibetan contraband in the
exactly.
Shravaka library.
And I said, "Can I see that book?" And at first they said no. And I said, "I'm going to leave, so just let me look at the book." And I opened it and, I realized, and this maybe gets into ethics,
Yeah.
that he is was a controversial character in many ways.
Yeah.
Um, and there's some debate about how much he wrote that book anyway, but
Yeah.
that book just changed my life. Like, I read it and the book it's a mix. It has a lot of sort of their dogma and all sorts of things, but it had these beautiful Dzogchen teachings
Hmm.
embedded in it. And I read it and it was like my whole mind just opened to what I'm calling natural awareness, like this shift in consciousness. And it was like, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to get. You're here. The mind is already innately pure, luminous, bright. Here it is,
Mm.
and it was like just, and then of course it's on 7 months of concentration, right?
Yeah.
So you can
Oh, that's
imagine.
great. Yeah. That's when you're happy to have all that concentration. Yeah.
Exactly. And so then from then on, I just started practicing like that, and I also started having to do a lot of compassion practice for myself. And I just spent like every day, half the day was compassion practice, and the other half of the day was more of this open awareness practices and a few minutes of noting so that I could report
Hmm.
with the teacher.
Right.
But and it was amazing. It was some of the most beautiful months of my entire life,
Mm.
and then, of course, so I stayed until I kind of was what I felt was done, like,
Hmm.
and I went to India and I did all this stuff and taught in the school, and I met my first teacher who was an Italian sort of he ran the school. He was this wild guy. He ran the school that was based in these teachings. Like, he taught the kids non-dual
Hmm.
practices in the school. It's called Universal Education. It's in
Uh-huh.
Sarnath. So he was like my first kind of like actual tangible teacher. But then when I came back to the States, I was trying to understand like what I was learning and what I was practicing. And that's when I met Tsoknyi Rinpoche. And I started
Yeah.
getting exposure to non-dual teachings, Charles Genoux, but like there was a whole set of teachers that I explored and worked with. And also, of course, at that point in the insight meditation world, a lot of the teachers were teaching that way,
Yeah.
and so I was getting it a lot from my colleagues and friends and peers. And so it all just kind of began to unfold in that
Mm.
way. Yeah.
Nice. It is ironic that that book was the doorway to freedom for you because it's a great book, but the putative author has subsequently been unmasked as a fairly unethical teacher. This is Sogyal Rinpoche's book. I believe Andrew Harvey wrote a lot of it or, edited aggressively. So it's definitely, it's a book worth reading and having, but I didn't get too far into the details of what happened to Sogyal, but I guess it was, sexual abuse and authoritarian outbursts behind closed doors.
Yes. Power, money, sex, the whole deal.
Yeah,
But yeah, he was
he had it all.
abusive. Yes.
Yeah. I must say, I met him a few times. He was the student of many of my teachers, like Tukuri Rinpoche and Khensa Rinpoche and Nyoshe Ken Rinpoche. And so I would see him sometimes in the context of seeing them. I mean, he was around, or he would have organized an event, or he always struck me as someone who was doing the kind of happy Lama act. And I was never attracted to studying with him personally. So something seemed off about him to me. I mean, he seemed like he really was very eager to build a big organization and have lots of centers, and the trappings of being a big Lama were something that he was having a lot of fun with. So, I mean, there's no question that Sogyal had a practice of a sort that we're describing here, right? Like, non-dual awareness was something he, I'm sure, had experienced. He could probably experience it whenever he wanted to. Yeah, I mean, it would be absurd to think that he didn't know how to practice Dzogchen. Yet it is advertised in the teachings that there's a fairly direct connection between insight into selflessness, insight into emptiness, insight into the nature of consciousness, and being a good person in the world, living ethically, no longer being pushed from behind by your own narcissism and craving and anger and anything else that would cause you to behave egregiously badly in the world. I mean, there's a recognition that most people won't be stable in this thing, and therefore when they're, lost in thought, they will be who they've tended to be, their whole lives prior to that. But still, when you're talking about somebody like Sogyal or anyone who has had every opportunity to be a great meditation master and is sort of advertising himself or herself as one, it's always surprising to find out that they're not only just a little bit chaotic and a little bit bad and a little bit unethical behind closed doors, but they're just, they're behaving in ways that are unconscionable. And worse still, this is almost par for the course with teachers. Like, you can almost think of more teachers than not who have had scandals of this kind. I mean, certainly Asian gurus who wind up acquiring huge Western followings. What do you think about all that? How do you explain that to yourself and any skeptical person who would think this is all just a fool's errand? Obviously, it doesn't matter how much you meditate, you can be guilty of, you basically become Charles Manson.
Oh, it's not that bad. I think there's a couple of pieces here. I think that there's the phenomenon of gurus from Asia coming to the US and falling. And I think that although I hear that things were going on in the monasteries in Tibet as well that were problematic. But I think that once they're removed from the cultural holding, that it's like anything goes in a way. And oftentimes one of the biggest problems is they don't have any peers, right? They're not with their teacher anymore. Nobody's looking over their shoulder. And then they come to these Western countries and it's just a very different context, and they start acting out in often really egregious ways. And so this is not, never, ever, ever any excuse. I'm just sort of trying to understand it mostly. I think that spiritual awakening or spiritual attainments does not necessarily translate across the board to other dimensions of our life. I don't think that it necessarily means that it's going to impact our emotional life or our ethical life. It should. And a lot of the spiritual teachings say that it should, but it doesn't. I've just seen it for so long. People with realizations acting out. So I think that, I'm not, here's another person with some issues, but Ken Wilber, right, who I like the way he talks about different lines of development. I think that's helpful for understanding that we need to develop we have our spiritual development, but we still may have to develop our way we relate emotionally. And that's why I think for me, it's really important. A number of things are really important. One is I continue to do my work. I continue to meditate. A lot of meditation teachers at some point decide they don't have to keep practicing, right? So that's one. So keeping practicing. I do other things like therapy and make sure that I'm working on other aspects of myself that maybe are not touched through my meditation practice. And then having peers and colleagues, so that I have a joke with my closest colleague, Marvin, who I work with, and we say whenever we don't want to tell the other person something, that's when we have to tell them, because that will keep us honest and keep us authentic. So if people don't have these kinds of support, then they're going to fail. It doesn't matter how enlightened they are, I think.
There's certainly more to living a fully actualized, integrated life than being able to cut through the illusion of the self. It's like there's more to culture than that. There's more. We're reliant on our culture as an operating system. Having ethical norms that you're striving to maintain, that will shift depending on what culture you're in, right? So you're talking about somebody who has come from in the case of a Tibetan teacher, from a theocracy. They have, cultural norms that just don't map onto our own very well. And that comes with certain liabilities when you get into a teaching role and you've got everybody's unbounded adoration and acquiescence, pointed your way. It's easy to see how you can get in trouble with that. So I agree, there's more tools to have to keep you on the right track. Is it possible to be enlightened, quote, enlightened, stable in this recognition of awareness, and still be an asshole?
Well, partially to answer that question, I would say we don't ever really know what's happened in someone's mind. So they may be held up as having had certain attainments and they may not, you know. I have met a lot of counterexamples, you know, people who are supposedly very realized and who have acted like jerks and jerks in extreme ways. And so I feel like, I mean, it doesn't make sense in my mind that it makes you like necessarily a better person. But on the other hand, I've seen like so many people who have become better people by doing these practices. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
The easiest explanation for me, based on my own experience, is that whenever you're lost in thought, you are well and truly lost for any, I mean, you know, it's identification with thought is somewhat like being psychotic. It's a little touch of psychosis. It's a little bit like being asleep and dreaming and not knowing that you're dreaming. You know, it's like you know, having a non-lucid dream. You know, that's like if you could get up and walk around in that state, you're psychotic, right? So like it's the only thing that's keeping you sane is the fact that you can't get out of bed while dreaming. And there's something about being captured by thought that has a similar flavor to that. And so I think as long as your moment to moment experience is still admitting of the possibility of just being identified, you know, just having thought come up from behind and seeming to become you rather than you recognizing it as an appearance in consciousness, then the only safeguard against being an asshole and or not being taken wherever that thought leads is to have some other sort of superstructure of thinking, some other, you know, conceptual framework of how you want to be in the world. I mean, having an ethical code, having a belief about yourself and others around you who believe this about you, that you're not the sort of person who does X, Y, and Z, right? And so that you have to have a feedback mechanism of cultural expectations and your own internal demand to have a coherent personality. Like you can't say one thing to your best friend and then another thing to your wife and then another thing. It's like if there's a burden of ethical coherence that you're going to place on your experience, it is a kind of conceptual overlay. It's like train tracks that you're putting across the ocean of emptiness that you're trying to stay on, because if they don't have any of that, that does open the door to this, you know, potentially very dangerous and dishonest landscape of what's called crazy wisdom usually in the Tibetan tradition, where you can seemingly always justify norm-breaking behavior as a strategy to wake people up. Like, why did I just pull down my pants and expose myself to a room full of strangers? It's to shock them awake. The guru can always say that, and presumably many of these teachers can always believe that about themselves. And the teachings are full of ostensibly edifying stories about yogis and teachers who have behaved in totally chaotic ways because their method is just this kind of ceaseless breaking of norms. I guess there's some version of that that's compatible with an internal state of total freedom, but at bottom, it just seems to me fundamentally unnecessary. It's like enlightenment, whatever it is, never needs to show up that way. There's nothing, I see no requirement to be ethically unnerving to everyone around you as a way of transmitting non-dual wisdom. You could just transmit the non-dual wisdom and be a mensch as well.
Yeah. But some of these people, there's like an alcohol problem
Right.
that
Well, yeah,
is
like
adding
Trungpa.
to it.
Yeah.
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 So, and I think there's a way that we have these blind spots. Every single one of us, even enlightened masters, have these blind spots, and we don't know what we don't know, you know, and we act out of them all the time. And you know, for me, I speculate on why, and I agree with a lot of you know, everything you're saying, and I also think the more for me the question is like, how do we deal with the fallout, right? How do we deal with these communities where what kind of support is in place for picking up the pieces so that when people do experience this, which they do all the time, you know, how do they not lose faith in their faith is the wrong word, but how do we not lose our trust and our commitment to our practice when our teacher falls, you know? And there aren't a lot of systems in place, although communities are putting them into place usually after there's been a fall, right? And also, like, how do we talk to people to, like, was it okay for me to get so much benefit from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying when Sogyal Rinpoche is an abuser of in certain ways? Like, and I think that we have to learn to have a nuanced perspective, that not condoning the actions of these people, but not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because there's that tendency, right? People are like, okay, I'm never going to pay attention to their teaching ever again. And I think that's not helpful either. And helping people to see that oftentimes the fall of the guru is actually an important part of their spiritual journey, and that where they come back to themselves and learn, like, the inner guru, the inner wisdom. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I think the teachings are distinct from whoever articulated them. It could be totally useful to you and true to follow a certain instruction to its intended effect, and it doesn't matter that the person who communicated that wasn't doing it enough himself or herself. And also, I guess there's the counterfactual problem of you don't know how bad anyone would be if they hadn't ever practiced, right? I mean,
True.
who would Sogyal have been if he'd just been some Wall Street guy who never was associated with Dharma teachings? I don't know. Well, I guess in this vein, do you think the traditional guru-disciple schema is unworkable or unnecessary now? I mean, it's the 21st century. Do we need to put teachers on any kind of pedestal, or can teachers be transmitting this wisdom very much the way your golf instructor would transmit what he has to teach, without that being a vastly hierarchical relationship?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think that things have changed a lot, and that there is more of a horizontal relationship of power that is welcome. And I think it's beautiful to see that there's not this, like, guru devotion, because that's where there can be these abuses of power. But then we run the risk of sort of like everybody is the same, when actually people do have things to share, and that should be, and often quite a lot of wisdom that that can be conveyed. So I think for me, the way we sort of do it in our center at UCLA, and that what I've seen a lot in some of the also insight meditation tradition, is communities of teachers who people revere, but also recognize that they're human, and we don't have to go through this whole guru devotion path to gain their wisdom. Because as a teacher, I don't want people to feel...
Well, in the Vipassana tradition, it's always been more about the teachings than the teacher. I mean, that's
Yes.
one reason
Yes.
why the Vipassana tradition has escaped this more than others, where guru devotion is, if not the only method, certainly part of the methodology. So that's been a benefit, I think. So in closing, what are you focusing on now in your work, and where can people find out more about what you're doing?
Well, so I'm at UCLA and continuing to develop more programs, and also training teachers in mindfulness. And one of the initiatives that I've been involved with for the last number of years has been really, in some ways, to address these issues we've been talking about today. It's called the International Mindfulness Teachers Association. It's a membership organization, and it provides credentials to mindfulness teachers. Because part of the problem, and this is, everybody can be a mindfulness teacher. Everybody may not be a skilled mindfulness teacher, but we do, at the moment, it's kind of the wild, wild west, right? There's no standards for who can be it. You can take a weekend workshop in mindfulness and then put out a shingle and say that you're a mindfulness teacher. And it's kind of funny because it feels like there's no other field where this happens. Like, I would not go to my tennis class.
Well, you can be president of the United States
Oh, yeah, there's
without
that.
any qualifications. So
Good point. But I wouldn't go to, like, learn cooking and then for 3 minutes and then go out and teach cooking. But people do this with mindfulness, right? They take a workshop. So we're looking at ways of creating standards, and those standards are standards for teacher training programs, and standards for what does it mean to be a professional mindfulness facilitator or teacher. And then we want to have an ethical board for dealing with this, because it's probably never going to happen in Buddhism. I don't think it is, but why not in the mindfulness world? Why can't we have a place for grievances and a creation of an ethical code that all mindfulness teachers need to abide by? And I think this is all like a direction that, I mean, it's rough moving in this direction because it's hard to take a field that's incredibly diverse in many ways, and also people are doing their own thing, and it's a little bit like a paradigm shift and saying, no, let's actually standardize this. But I think it's really important for the future of the mindfulness field. So that's another thing that I've been part of. And
Are you in collaboration with any of the obvious places for this, like IMS or Spirit Rock, or is this a totally separate?
it's a nonprofit, and it's not Buddhist, so it's not in collaboration. But a number of the people who are connected are on the advisory board. So, and then we're connected to the whole like giant field of mindfulness as mindfulness explodes in this culture. There are a lot of experts who are part of what we're doing, who are really bought into this. So those are some of the things that I'm up to, and I have my book, and I teach from it and do a lot of online stuff as well. And I have a website.
Nice. What's the website?
So I have dianawinston.com, and then the UCLA website, which has a lot of the many things that are going on at UCLA, and mindfulness is, uclahealth.org/MARC, Mindful Awareness Research Center.
Are you still teaching a class at the Hammer Museum? Is that okay?
Yeah. So for 10 years now, I've been every Thursday at 12:30 at the Hammer Museum. I lead a half-hour meditation.
Oh, great.
And that's all. Oh, it's all podcast in my app. I mean, the UCLA app.
Right.
UCLA Mindful.
And again, the book is The Little Book of Being, Practices and Guidance for Uncovering Your Natural